Welcome to the Performance Assurance Annual Report webinar. My name is Amy and I work on the communications team for the Rec Code Manager, and I will be facilitating today's session. I have joining me today colleagues from across the Rec Code Manager team. So just a few bits of housekeeping to kick us off. This session is being recorded, and the recording and the slides for this event will be made available on the Rec portal next week. If everyone could please keep their microphones and cameras off unless they're speaking, it would be greatly appreciated. So to raise your questions today, we are using Slido, and it should be coming up on screen in a second, but I think we're having some technical difficulties. Bear with me, everyone's apologies.
And whilst Amy's trying to fix it, I will just pop the link into the chat for you as well.
Thanks, Millie.
No worries at all.
So let's try that again. So there we go. As I said, we are using Slido today, and you can access Slido by using the QR code that's currently on the screen. So if you have a smartphone, you can scan this QR code with your camera, and it will take you straight to Slido, or you can type the number that's on screen into Slido on your web browser. Alternatively, if you're using the desktop app for Teams, you'll be able to see an S at the top of this call where you can click and access Slido. We do have a designated Q&A section, but please feel free to raise your questions as they come to you throughout the session. And I will now pass over to Eliana, who is going to take us through the agenda for today.
Thanks, Amy, and hi everyone. So I'm Eliana Campbell. I'm the Industry Engagement and Governance Lead on the Performance Assurance team. And also as part of my role, I am also the PAB Secretary as well. So I'm going to be talking you through the agenda for today, which is what you can see on screen now. And I'll also be joined by other members of our team as well to go through different elements of the agenda. So we'll start off by just giving a kind of purpose of what this webinar aims to do. So as Amy mentioned, this is to talk about our Performance Assurance Annual Report, which has now been published and can be found on the Rec portal. So hopefully everyone has received a link to that and you've had a bit of time to look through that before this session. But don't worry if not, because we're going to run through some of the key themes during this session today. That's kind of the whole purpose. But we also thought it was really important to link that to our activity for year 2 as well. They are obviously closely linked, so we'll talk you through some of the lessons we learned from year 1, but also how that flows into our year 2 activity as well in the operating plan. So just to run you briefly through these items, so I'll start off by just giving a bit about the role of the code manager and specifically our team. So hopefully if you've been to some of our webinars before, this will be a useful refresher on that. But if you haven't, then it'll just introduce and set the scene for some of the activity that we do as a performance assurance team. I'll then introduce you to the annual report, what the purpose of the report is, and also the interaction that we've had with the Performance Assurance Board on developing that report as well. I will then hand over to my colleague Anton, who will talk you through some of the key themes in a bit more detail from year 1, and then also give the overview of the operating plan for year 2 as well. And then we'll have plenty of time on the agenda to talk through any of the questions that you've had throughout the session. So as Amy mentioned, please do drop those in through Slido, or if you've got any questions, please raise your hand and we're happy to take those verbally as well. What I would say is we're just really keen for this to be as interactive as possible. So please do make sure if you've got any thoughts or feedback that you want to feed in, then we're really keen to make this as interactive as possible. particularly on the operating plan section, I would say, as we've got a consultation that's currently live for the operating plan. So we're gathering feedback through that method, but obviously we're all together today on this webinar, so it would be great if you do have any feedback on that, then we can kind of take that live and gather feedback through that mechanism as well. And it's worth saying as well, in that Q&A section, we will be joined by one of our PAB members, and also we've got the PAB chair as well, who will be joining us too. So there'll be some different perspectives on some of those questions as well, and we'll do our best to answer those in that session. So if we just move on to the next slide and the one after. So what we've done here is just draw out some of the key things and what our role is as a performance assurance team. So kind of talking about what we do and kind of more importantly, kind of why we do it and why we do it in this way as well. So the list that you can see on screen here is by no means an exhaustive list of everything that we do, but it's really the key focus areas that we do as a team to kind of draw your attention to, and also help set the scene for the annual report as well, because we talk about these things in more detail within the annual report. So at a very high level, kind of what we do as a team, the role of our team is to manage and monitor party and service provider performance and intervene to help improve market performance. So we could either do that at an individual level, or we can do that at a market level. And it's really about what that data is showing in order for us to be able to kind of pick what the most appropriate intervention is. So just focusing a bit more on kind of specific activity that we do. So the first one that we've got on the list is our activity around market entry and qualification. So this is all about making sure that people that are operating within the market can genuinely deliver REC processes and do not cause problems for their customers or other market participants. So we think this is a really important thing that we do to make sure that we're kind of robust gatekeepers for anyone that's entering or existing in the market, to make sure that they're doing and operating as they're supposed to. The second thing on the list in terms of what we do is around party monitoring, which I've mentioned briefly. But what we do here is we monitor data and we apply those techniques to try and resolve the root cause of the issue. So I think this is a really kind of important part of our role, in terms of we don't just have a kind of one size fits all blanket approach to our assurance. We don't do the same assessments on absolutely everyone in the market. We do it so it's kind of tailored to what the data is showing based on kind of the monitoring and the risks that are presenting. So really the reason why we do this in this way is to minimise the interaction with those who are compliant and focus our attention in the right areas to improve performance. And then finally, the last area that I've called out is on service provider assurance. So we provide assurance and oversight of the service providers and central systems to make sure that they are delivering to the expected service levels. So we know this is a really important part of the kind of industry ecosystem, to make sure that these service providers are operating as they'd expect to, and really critically, the why in this case is making sure that they're delivering the value for money for their customers, which I'm sure kind of people on the call can recognise is a really important part of why we do that. So just flicking on to the next slide. What we've kind of done here is we've just grouped some additional activity. So I don't propose that I go into any of these in more detail, but it's just to give people on the call a flavour of other activities that you do, or you might have interaction with us on, to show that the additional activity that we do as a team. So some of these themes might come up as we go through this webinar in terms of what we set out in the annual report as well. So it's really just to give you that background and context of what we do as a team. Moving on to the next slide and just the one after. So this is where we start to get into kind of the real purpose of this webinar, and it's just introducing you to that annual report. So as I mentioned, it's now been published. It's on the REC portal under the Performance Assurance Board area. And it's obviously, as we've come to the end of our first year of operation, it focuses on those kind of the activity in the past 12 months and highlighting our performance assurance activities within that. And the way that we've structured the report is we have structured it in kind of 5 key areas which focus on the performance of parties, what the data showed in the first 12 months, also the performance of central systems, what the data showed on those that are kind of maintaining their qualification over the year, and also about what parties who are entering and also leaving the market as well. So they're the kind of key areas that Anton's going to talk you through a little bit more in terms of what the key themes showed from that first year. But I think it's worth drawing out that the annual report was developed and iterated alongside the Performance Assurance Board, and that's why we've got kind of members attending for the Q&A session as well to answer any questions from their perspective that you might have on the report. So the PAB were really keen and really constructive in giving us feedback on making sure that the report was concise, was making sure it was focused on our kind of high priority areas, but also having a kind of honest reflections of our first year of operation and also what we would do slightly differently, perhaps going into year 2, which is obviously why we're linking this into our operating plan, giving you an overview of that today as well. So what I've pulled out just finally on the bottom of the screen here is about how we have reflected on our progress made in year 1, and how we did devote a kind of significant amount of time on kind of transitional and other activities, whereas in year 2 we really want to spend the majority of our time improving performance, and we've listed out here some key activities that we're going to do to be able to do that. So it's things like understanding how CSS impacts consumer outcomes and acting to address any performance risks. We'll also be using data to understand where the code needs improving, and also again just about driving efficiency so more time can be spent on applying those techniques. So that's what the annual report kind of covers. You'll have seen, if you've had a look at it before this call, that it's not kind of a really lengthy report. Our aim was to try and make it quite concise and focused, but these are the key areas that we went into the detail of for the annual report. So I will hand over now to my colleague Anton, who's going to talk you through some of the key themes in a bit more detail.
Hello, everybody. So my name's Anton. I'm responsible for the performance assurance element of the Code Manager service and making sure that delivers the value that you would expect. Before we kind of get into the kind of pre-prepared content, it's really important to me that we're transparent with parties and service providers. I guess what we're doing, why we're doing it, what we're thinking. One of the features of our role and the kind of the nature of REC and its multi-party nature is that we are doing lots of different things in different areas, and it's not always visible to you if you only play one role with us. And I think it's really important to show all of these different activities, and also, you know, some of the bits that perhaps aren't activities, but what we're thinking and why we're doing things. So if we just kind of move on to the next slide. When we work with a PAB, one of the really clear steers from the PAB is that I think industry value transparency, and I think it's important to be transparent. We've achieved a lot in this year, but there have also been some challenges, and I think talking to you and setting the right tone on those is really important. So we've pulled out 3 particular challenges that I just want to address, and then I go into a more kind of theme-based discussion. The first one I want to talk about is data provision. So we've taken a holistic approach to the market. We behave in what perhaps is a really different way to other codes and to Ofgem, where we're asking parties to do things they haven't needed to do before. You know, sometimes this includes asking parties to give us information that tells us whether or not the REC is doing what it should. Sometimes it tells us whether or not service providers are doing what they should. Sometimes it tells us information about other parties. Now, this is new. This is really different. And this is something that's really important that we're clear about and open about and explain. And I do think over the year we've experienced some challenges in this, and I do think there have been some areas where we've realised we've needed to adjust. So we've taken on feedback from parties, we've adjusted our approach to particular items like the performance assurance report catalogue. We've changed our engagement approach, and actually that's something that you'll see going forward, and is a really important theme. It has been hard, but I think it's really important that we acknowledge this has probably been hard for you as well. I think data is really fundamental to the way that we're approaching this, though. It's our way of delivering a lot more efficiently than kind of the alternative approaches that are taking place elsewhere, things like a market audit. I think it's really important that as a code manager, we make this as easy as possible for organisations, that we engage with you in the right ways, and that we make it a smooth process. But I think it's also really important for parties, you know, to meet this. It's a really important regulatory obligation. Getting the right information is really the thing that allows us to be efficient. So I think when you look in our annual report, there is discussion on this, and when you look in our forward-looking plans, our operating plan, there are activities here. The other one that I wanted to acknowledge that has been really important is the rec portal. I just said it's really important in our role to make things efficient, make it easy to work with us, to make sure that with the limited time that you have, that you're doing value add things, not frustrating things, and that's true of our team as well. I think there's been an acknowledgement, and one of the things in the annual report, an acknowledgement from both the PAB and the code manager, that we probably need to do a little bit more in this space. You'll have seen that over the past year we've improved the portal in many ways. Perhaps if you've been a long-standing party, you won't have seen the improvements to the application process. We've made it clearer on performance assurance actions. We've made data submissions better. I think the thing to say is we're always going to be able to turn up to a call like this, a webinar like this, and say, well, there's areas for improvement. Actually, it's important to acknowledge that that's not exactly the message that I want to give here. We probably aren't where we need to be in this, and we are working really hard to get this into the right place. You'll see in the coming months improvements in this, designed to make it easier for you to interact with this portal, and I think some of them are really significant. It's also allowed, some of them, particularly dashboards, will allow you to see the information that we see on you, which I think is really important to the transparency. It'll allow you to understand how we're behaving and why, but I think more importantly, it'll allow you to understand your impacts on customers, and, you know, where required, proactively drive change to improve your own performance. The last one is on market entry and qualification. I think we have two slightly different dynamics in there, but the thing that I wanted to draw out is maintaining qualification. The maintenance of qualification is new for many organisations. I know under other codes there are different things, and I know that metering providers have had this concept for a long time. But it's really important. It's important to protecting the data that often is, you know, for example, suppliers' data and inquiry systems. It's really important for protecting customers' data. It's a really key regulatory requirement that Ofgem made sure was a key part of the REC. We've done lots on communicating what's required. We've been really clear on people what they need to do to complete, and we've been adjusting processes to make them as easy as we possibly can for parties and for us. However, one of the things that is a bit of a theme is that many of the organisations have struggled with this, and we see that through many missing submissions. When you read the annual report, you'll see some statistics and the types of organisations that have been requested. I'm really conscious that everything we do is a service that we provide for the benefits of customers and for the benefits of the parties. Actually, we've been spending lots of time chasing up submissions. It doesn't seem like an adding value process for us, and it doesn't seem like on the other side that the work responding to that is adding value. You know, clearly there's a balance to be struck here. We need to make sure we're doing this in the way that's easiest for you to understand what your deadlines are and your obligations. And there are some upcoming improvements that should make this easier. Notifications from the rec portal, an improved way of looking at your calendar and understanding what's coming up and when your obligations are. But actually, I think given how important an obligation this is, I think this will be a real area of focus for us to make sure we drive this in an efficient way. There is just one important piece of context I wanted to make sure people understood about maintaining qualification. We've chosen to take an approach of tranches, so different types of organisation have been in different months. Essentially, this does mean that some organisations simply haven't had their deadlines yet. The most notable of these, when we're issuing the report, was suppliers. So what I've said is certainly true for all of the organisations who've kind of been involved. We would hope suppliers, this isn't a problem that affects them. We'll obviously see that in the coming months. But I thought these were some of the challenges that we are facing and seeing, and I think we're assuming that you guys are facing and seeing as well. So we wanted to be open about them. It's not just challenges. It's not just challenges. If we move on to the next slide, I think it's really important to talk about what we're doing and why. And we do such a diverse set of things that it's important to do that in a structured way. Fundamentally, our role is understanding if the code and the ecosystem that supports that, which involves so many organisations, is working. A lot of that is focusing on compliance risks. A lot of it is focusing on parties exchanging data quickly and accurately to help each other, to help their customers, to make sure tasks like switching or topping up prepayment meters, or making sure that the right technical details are in the right databases so other organisations can then do the work that they need to, that happens on time and accurately. We have found in our work this year areas where the code isn't working, and the way that we've approached this, looking at the entire market, allows us to build a business case for change, which is quite different from what was possible in preceding codes. For example, did you know that only 16% of requests to transfer repayment debt were agreed within 28 working days? What does that tell us about the experience that people are having of this market, particularly vulnerable consumers? I think it does just identify key areas the code managers should be working and industry should be working to improve customer outcomes that can't be delivered by just one, say, supplier, just one metering agent, and that we need a bigger coordinated effort, and that is really an important part of our role and an important part of the rec code manager's role. I just wanted to go into some of the things that we've put on screen. The first one is performance of parties. Before I go into that and talk about what we're doing, I think I want to start with a really big thank you. Like previously in my career, I was involved on the other side, supporting a lot of different utility organisations in their regulatory submissions and gaining confidence in that. So I do know that every time there is a request for information, there is a request for data, that is a complex process. Sometimes it involves costs, and that needs to be treated with care. I really appreciate all of you who have been keeping on top of your obligations, reporting to us, engaging with us where it doesn't quite make sense to you. And actually, I really want to thank you. You've played your part. I appreciate it is complicated, that sometimes we're asking you to understand whether the code is working or the service providers, but it is really important. There is a real presumption in our model that this industry is trying to do the right thing. And one of the key barriers to that is getting the right information. We've seen this model working though. So we take a lot of information from central services, good examples, the DTN, and we've seen areas where people are underperforming and just an individual party, they're outliers. And I don't want to get into the specifics of individual organisations, but if I just tell a very simple story. We've been working with an IDNO who had a clear, consistent track record of several months of underperformance. When we spoke to them about this specific issue, they very quickly changed their performance and improved. They hadn't realised that they had these obligations, and pointing them out to them meant that they were quickly addressed. Now that's quite a simple case, right? But we've seen other areas where providing data to organisations has helped them prioritise delivering improvements in these areas and help them understand like what the impact is on customers so that they can address and drive better performance. The service design that has that presumption that industry will do the right thing has a real key element, which is providing you the right information. You can't do that in a vacuum, can you? You need some kind of information to do that. And performance dashboards are going to be a real key part of this. We'll be providing you more granular information so that you can see what we see about you. Right? Clearly, we won't be showing you the whole market's performance because some of that information is confidential to other organisations, but we will show you what the data is telling us about you. This will allow you to respond more proactively, address problems before they get to the stage where they might need kind of a performance assurance intervention. We've also worked with a PAB to work out what they expect. I think this is really important. I think the code is really large, right? And we can't practically monitor every single word of it. That wouldn't be cost beneficial. The PAB have expressed some really clear areas of focus, and that helps us prioritise our work. So a really key example of that is the PAB are really focused on erroneous switch resolution timelines. That they see this as an area that has a real customer benefit if it improved, and that we've got a decent sets of information and clear obligations in the code. And in the coming year, areas like that will be the areas that we will focus on driving improvements. I wanted to talk about some other areas as well. We look at the performance of central systems as much as we look at the performance of parties. And actually, this is a key area we deliver value and benefits to parties to the code. We are looking at the performance of the individual services as expressed through their kind of service definitions, the things that they should be delivering for you, but also in terms of the access and the way these systems are used. So, for example, on the electricity inquiry service, we found 160 organisations that had access to that service, but they didn't have a good reason for that access, an access under the data access schedule. We quickly investigated each of these, made sure we could validate that that was the case, and removed that access, protecting the confidentiality of customer data, which is really, really important at this. This is an area that's been ramping up, making sure all of the rec services are delivering the service that you expect for, and frankly parties pay for, is really important. The big change in the year, the massive elephant in the room change, is CSS going live. This has increased the scope of our work on these services because new services like the CSS services, the gas inquiry service, come on board. When we talk about our operating plan, you'll see that we're expecting a little bit more time in that area, and I think that's a really valuable activity that we do. I've talked about maintenance of qualification a little bit. You know, making things easier is always a focus for us, and part of that has been engaging other parts of the code manager in helping here, making sure that the messaging that we're giving is aligned and supportive with those interactions with OEMs that quite often we get feedback from that the parties really value. So I guess a big part of my role and some of my peers in the code manager is making sure we're aligned, and whilst we all have different key tasks and different key professional specialisms, that it all comes across the parties as an integrated whole, and that when interacting with OEMs, if you need to understand a bit more about specific performance assurance activities, or when performance assurance is thinking about the best way to communicate that we're getting advice from the OEMs and the stakeholder team, integrating that's been really important. The last two I'll kind of deal with together. We've worked hard on parties entering the market in particular. We've had much higher levels than we ever anticipated, and actually perhaps this is a kind of a catch-up effect, where first with the MRA and SPA coming on, and then gas inquiry service coming on, there was a bit of a backlog. Now, you might say, great, we're getting lots of value from this team working on more than they expected. Actually, when I think about what I want to say to parties about this, actually maybe high volumes is a really positive thing for us. It has made sure that we are really efficient and targeted. Like, we always aspired to improve the way we do this dramatically from the previous codes, and we've done that. Now this is a much more tailored process focused on the nature of an applicant's business model, how they interact with customers, what they will be doing in that market. This means that we're allocating the resource better. Organizations that are going to have a much larger role get much larger focus as they have more complicated risks. Organizations who have a much smaller role have targeted areas that focus on the risks that they present. This makes the most of the resources that we have in the code manager, but also really, and I think this is more important, this provides a more meaningful set of controls that protects market participants. It's in no one's interest that organizations enter this market who aren't ready. They would spread unnecessary costs around and impact consumers in a way that damages the trust in the industry that I guess we are all invested in improving. Behind the scenes, though, there's been a lot of improvement, and perhaps things that you wouldn't necessarily know. So there've been improvements on how API access is provisioned to the inquiry services. There's been development of a much clearer and easier to understand data access matrix, which is part of us communicating better around what's available, but also part of us communicating with parties who are already there about the information that's on that endpoint that can be accessed through the graphical interface or the API. We've provided flexibility to support innovation. Actually, the future of the energy market is going to change, isn't it? And I know there's some large structural changes happening at the moment to do with things outside of our control, a bigger economy, a war. I'm not talking about those things. I think independently there's a load of innovators out there who want to use data in better ways, find ways of improving their products to get better customer satisfaction, reduce cost to serve. All of this is the way that the market will drive improvements. It's not for Reco and the code manager to drive those improvements. It's for us to facilitate this, make sure it's done in a controlled and protected way, and we've done that. This has involved assessing different use cases for that data, making sure whilst we're doing that, we're thinking really clearly about the impact and protecting that customer data, but also finding ways that we don't unnecessarily put up barriers, that any barriers or controls are meaningful. The other one I'd just like to point out is much more granular and targeted control market entry conditions. So CME conditions, as we call them, existed previously in electricity, and now they for electricity suppliers and DNOs, and now they apply across the piece. They are used only when needed, but they're now focused on a more detailed understanding of the business model of different organisations, and the way that problems could arise due to inexperience or overly aggressive growth that need to be managed. They're not a one-size-fits-all approach based on connections anymore. They're actually tailored to the business model, and sometimes they involve NPXN limits. Other times they talk about the kind of capabilities people will need and providing us assurance they have them as they grow. But actually having a more tailored and targeted approach to control market entry conditions is really important, so that, as I said, we don't get in the way unnecessarily, but really importantly that we are protecting the risks to the market and focusing in those areas. So that's all I had to say on these. Each of these areas is expanded in more detail in our annual report, and I'm sure many of you will be looking at that in detail. That's kind of the past, although I've kind of blended some of the areas we'll be focusing on in the future. We have a separate document that's a bit more formally what our operating plan is going forwards. I just wanted to talk a little bit about that in the next section. So if we could go on probably 2 slides. One of the things that we think is quite important to do is communicate how we're using our time and where we're focusing, but particularly as, like, I'm sure not everybody understands all of the areas of our role and why they're there. One of the simplest ways we do it is with this little pie chart. And what this pie chart tells you is about how we are deciding to use our time in different areas of the service, which really are about either different approaches to managing risk or different types of participant. So it's split into a few areas: maintenance of qualification, entry, which I think are fairly well talked about, party monitoring. So this is using data to monitoring existing parties in their market and their performance, and then intervening where there are issues or risks. Direct assessment, which again looks at parties, but actually is the part of our job where that technique wouldn't be appropriate. So examples of that are, we don't think data monitoring is the right way to talk about PSR data. That data is very, very sensitive and perhaps isn't stuff that should travel around. Maybe there's a different approach there. Sometimes information security has this characteristic as well. But then also looking at service providers. So what you'll see on the left is the breakdown of what we actually said. And when we started, we had our estimates of where we thought we'd spend our time, but things have changed. Things have changed as they do. The most obvious thing that changed is when we started and published our originally our operating plan. We were expecting CSS to go live a bit earlier. The associated services like the gas inquiry service. That hasn't been how it worked out. So actually, we have done less on service providers than we expected because they came into our scope only at the point of CSS go live, and actually there will be a ramping up of our kind of scrutiny of those service providers post switching program exit. The other thing that we talked about is a much higher than anticipated interest in entering this market. I personally think that a lot of this was backlog, and I think that overall our volumes will reduce. I also think, as I said, it's allowed us to make sure we're really efficient and provided an impetus, and that will obviously apply as this service goes forward through the years. So we do expect those areas to reduce, entry to reduce, and service provider elements to increase. We're looking at driving efficiencies for all of us in maintenance of qualification. So that's spending less time on administrative actions, chasing people who haven't submitted, which isn't a massively valuable activity. It's needed, but not hugely value add, and just making sure that sliver of time is all of the value add assurance activity we can deliver. So I thought that just gave you an idea of our areas of focus. We do plan, I guess, this time next year to tell you, what we planned and then where we spent our time. So we will continue to report against this because I think it's a really important thing that parties understand and can think about. If we can just move on to our next slide. In the operating plan, there is quite a lot of detail, and we've tried to summarise this onto one slide, right? There is also, perhaps I think is the most useful element of this, a simple Gantt chart in the plan that tells you about when things might be happening. Now, some of these things happen all the time, every month. So, for example, we will be monitoring parties, and the additional techniques that we apply will depend on how the market behaves. So some of those are all the way across. Others, there are specific activities that we will be completing. So, for example, we talked about data. One of the things that we'll be doing in a specific month is checking every single piece of data that we're asking to be submitted, is valuable, is still needed, meets that cost benefit test. And, if there are ones that we think are no longer needed, then we'll update that. And I think that is what you'd expect of us. So like one-off activities. There are also some things that you might need to think about. A really clear example of this is the theft detection incentive scheme. Now, whilst there are monthly requirements for parties or suppliers to do specific data submissions, actually there's a natural annual cycle here with some key points where we would expect you guys to have done your final validations, make sure everything is finally updated and accurate before we kind of close the books on that scheme. So it should be helpful for you to understand what we're doing, but also what you might need to do. We talk about some of these, and actually some of these techniques that we're putting on the screen, they're continuations, and some of them are probably kind of things that will be going into perpetuity. A good example of that is market entry. We're not going to stop market entry. That's a really important technique that protects the market, but it's important that we articulate that and how that works. Similarly, control market entry, maintenance of qualification, and our monthly risk assessment and determination process. There are some bits that are specific to this year, though. We've talked about dashboard pre-release webinars. For me, I went back to that. It's important that we show people why we're doing what we're thinking and how we see things. I think when we start providing dashboards, it's important that we also provide you guys an opportunity to understand what they mean or how we think about them and how we classify data and respond to it. So there will be engagement sessions where we allow you to, see what they look like, see how you access them. But for me, see what they mean. I think that's the most important thing. So it won't just be a technical demonstration, or that's clearly needed. It'll also be about what do these mean? What should you do if you see this type of data or that type of trend? So we're seeing two on the screen. Some of those is pre-release. We probably need a post-release drop-in sessions in case people have questions when they see their own, things like that. There are some specific additional techniques that we're applying. We talked about the success of that EES access. Well, it was the data access audit, wasn't it? And the outcomes that were achieved because of that. We think that doing the same on the gas inquiry service is a really sensible thing to do, so that we can be confident that that access model is clean and progress with that confidence for consumers. But there are some other things. We talked about PSR in our last operating plan, self-assessments for PSR accuracy. It will be a really important one for network bodies in this, and some of those other peer comparisons we talked about. I think I've given an overview. I don't think we'll take questions on this now, but if there are questions on this in the Q&A, I think we'd be more than happy to take that. If we just move on to the next slide. When we're thinking about our operating plan, it does come from what should we be doing different, what's working, what's not working, And there are a couple of things that real key development priorities that we had. I think one of them is communication. I think you will have seen a change and an adjustment in the way that we have communicated with organisations. That's something that I think we're keen to continue delivering. But I also think it shouldn't always be done too. So we are asking for feedback on this. We have some ideas on what kind of communications we should be giving, regular webinars and the kind of proposed agendas for that. But really, the communications we should be giving are the ones that you value, not necessarily the ones that we wish to send, if that makes sense. So there are some questions on there about, you know, are these the kind of things that you would value getting information from the performance assurance team? Are there other things that would be, you know, more valuable or more useful to you? We've talked about the dashboard launch. We've talked also about integration of different code manager activities, and one of those is just clearer interaction with the change process. Several of you may actually interact with some of the change panels or committees or performance assurance boards yourself, but actually just integrating it so it's a bit clearer for those who support us in that space, how these things are integrated, we think is a development area. And then also on data collection. I think that data collection is a real key priority for us, and getting the, you know, the right data, making the most use of it, doing it in the most efficient way is always going to be important to us. You'll see on the screen that there is a live consultation on that. We really do want your feedback, and actually one of the things that the PAB said, and I thought was really insightful: please respond to our consultation. We want to do things in the way that values that you value. That would be our preferred approach of how you input, but please, any way you wish to input, we would welcome it. If you want to talk to your OAM and just be clear to feed that back, they feed that back to us, we'd welcome that. If you want to feed us back things today in the Q&A, we'd welcome that. If you want to send things in as an email, we'd welcome that. If you want to talk to our help desk, we'd welcome that. You know, certainly my consultation is the preferred method, but getting your input is really important to us. So please do that in the way that you feel fit. So that was the information that we had prepared. I think if we move on to the next slide, we're into potentially the most exciting bit.
So we've had quite a few questions come through. So I'll work from the top down. So the first one, data provision needs to flow both ways. Parties need to have access to the data used by the code manager to determine their level of compliance. And there's a part two, there needs to be a consistent approach to the feedback provided and subsequent engagement. Any comments on this?
I totally agree with that. And I don't know who wrote that, but I entirely support that. Communication needs to be both ways. That's really right. Dashboards are fundamentally like the building block that allows that. I think if you can see what we see, then any subsequent action will make much more sense. I think if you can see your performance getting worse, you can start, you know, understanding what's underlying that data. You can start, you know, identifying how to address it, or maybe, you know, let's be honest, it's not always down to that individual party. There may be some external factors that are driving that. You can talk to us about that. I think that two-way communication is fundamental. Like those top two, I agree with every single word.
Thanks, Anton. Next one, when will the performance dashboards be available?
So the performance dashboards are in development at the moment, and they will be available in the coming months. I'm not sure if any of my colleagues are on the call who might have a. Well, I've left that to the beyond a pregnant pause, but I think that's the answer that I have there. I think it's important to say we have communication plans. We've talked about little bits of them today, but you will be getting gradual information on this so that you can prepare and see it coming, I think is the way to say it.
Thank you. Next one, what one thing would the performance assurance team highlight as successful in the past year?
Well, I think we've highlighted a whole load of successes, and I think the existence of this regime is really changed some of the dynamics. I think that the area I see this change the most is with service providers. Actually, it's really important that you get the value that you should expect from, you know, consistent, available services. We see a lot of times challenges with some of the services, maybe DTN availability, directly showing up in performance data. Now that doesn't mean, you know, name a supplier or name a mem has done something wrong. It means that outage has impacted all of those businesses. They've all needed to respond to it, and all of their customers who are interacting in that time, you know, have had impacts. I think we've already seen some change in behaviours in some of our service providers because of the way that the regime is structured. I think that's really positive, and I think that's really valuable.
Thank you. How do you factor in performance impact on parties of any failure of central systems?
So this probably shows that I'm not reading these questions, doesn't it? I answered the one in front of me. I think we've kind of covered that a little bit. So we obviously have information independent of the data. So when there's a DTN outage, we know about it, as I'm sure you do. We factor that in when we review kind of performance data. It clearly is not down to, as I've said, name a supplier, name a mem, to make sure, say, the DTN is consistently available. And as soon as there are outages, we see those in your performance, but it is not reasonable for us to just assume you're accountable for that. I guess this is the whole point of our regime, right? If I look at one organisation, I can see how things affect either other participants, and I can see how they affect consumers, but I can't attribute that necessarily to their actions. Now clearly there are times when parties haven't done what they should, and that has impacted a consumer. That definitely takes place, and those things need to be addressed. But the ability to see across the market, we can identify where that is. Now, you won't get an RFI from me about a dip in performance if we already know that it's caused by DTN outage. There haven't been a flurry of performance assurance techniques around CSS go live, and those of you who have received an RFI and RFC probably see in there a question that says, are there any external factors that have contributed to this, things that are outside of your control? We acknowledge that there isn't that one-to-one relationship where the party who's interacting with the customer is always accountable or causing things. That's the whole point of our regime. So we do take it into account. We never go off straight onto the bigger paths, if that makes sense. My team hear this a lot. We have to gather before we give. We have to understand first. So whenever we see something in the data, we start with something that gives us more information. So a request for clarification, maybe a request for information, so we can flesh these things out. I think I've given quite a long answer to that. I think I should leave that there.
Next question, where is the annual report in the portal? We are struggling to find it.
Eliana, could you help me with this?
Yes, I am just about to put the link in the chat, but it's under the Performance Assurance Board section under useful documents. So I'll drop it in the chat. If anyone has any trouble accessing that, then just let me know and we can work that out after the session.
Thanks, Eliana. Next question, how do you measure the success of performance assurance? How would our customers be assured that the money being spent on it is resulting in a benefit to them?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important question that we think about a lot. Like, if you think about the purpose of performance assurance, is building trust
that industry processes deliver customer outcomes. I think there's a lot of evidence out there that customers don't have as high levels of trust in this industry compared to other industries, right? I really think that's true, and I think our customers, like end consumers, would be assured that there is a team out there looking to understand what is being delivered and why, and making sure that where customers aren't getting the outcomes that they should expect, that action's taken. So I think that would be the key thing. It's assured. We do get questions about the level of benefit. I personally strongly believe that the level of benefit far outweighs the cost of what we do. But when we try and think about how do we measure that, I think it's a very complicated ecosystem. So, for example, perhaps you'll all read the Ofgem surveys that come out quarterly. Perhaps in coming months, trust in the industry may dip. Part of that we play a role in, but I don't think we entirely, we far from entirely control that. We also thought about appropriate ways to quantify things, but actually I think it's really important if we did that, we came to you with something really meaningful. Fundamentally, we make the code itself more valuable, and we make the service provision more effective, and we support the benefits that the service providers deliver and the benefits that the code itself delivers. So I don't think it's entirely separable, from valuing the benefit of the code.
Next question. What is the REC doing to reduce the number of solar by making the test for entry more rigorous, including financial resilience and scope, as it is a retail risk?
So clearly solars provide, well, maybe that's not the right way to say it. Failures of supplier clearly result in dramatic impacts on consumers. And I think we're pleased that the supplier last resort process is there, and those suppliers, those solar providers, are doing something valuable to support customer outcomes. Now, financial resilience is not part of the scope of our work. It's clearly within the remit of Ofgem. Like I must say, it's a really important piece, and yeah, I think that piece of market design is crucial. So I think the person that raised that, like I do agree, having an overall reduction in the number of solars would really benefit the market. However, it's really important that we work, and I think many of you on the call would expect this of us, that we work within our remit. And I think one of the pieces within our remit on solar is making sure, going back to that, we talked about DTM outages as an example, going back to that, understanding the context. Where there is a solar event, actually it can be quite complicated for the supplier of last resort to deal with some of the issues. Like inherently a failed business has a lot of problems, and has probably been under strain for a long time. I think our role is making sure that those customer outcomes are delivered, but also that there's some pragmatism in this space. So I know the code manager is doing some thinking around solar processes and what should be expected. But I don't think unless there was a government change, the request that set that within the scope of the REC, that we would be looking at financial resilience.
Do the PAB chair or any PAB members on the webinar have any reflections on year one or particular focus areas for year two?
Shall I try and pick that up unless anyone else is happy to chip in? I don't know if everyone can hear me. Sorry if it's a bit noisy in the background. I think year 2 is essentially got to be pretty much as Anton has tried to describe and as the questions have been alluding to. The first year has been almost a continuation of mobilisation. An awful lot of things had to be put in place to facilitate this regime being effective. The collecting of the data has obviously been a fundamental early step, because everything has to be evidence driven. We don't want to just target efforts willy-nilly based on our own preconceptions of what's gone right or wrong in the market, or based on kind of spurious data. So it's important to have got that in. So we shouldn't underestimate the amount of effort that's taken to put that pausing catalogue in place and to kind of go through the iterations that we've had to make sure that the data we're asking for is relevant and resonates with people in terms of which risks it relates to, etc. So it's been a progress, very slow progress, kind of getting things up and running. But I think it's absolutely right in terms of the questions that we've had in terms of being able to demonstrate the value for money for this, because it's, as we've often said on the PAB and elsewhere, it's easy to articulate the benefits case for performance assurance in the wholesale markets, where it's all about the accuracy of settlements and making sure that you're not picking up cost which isn't associated with your own purchases and your own consumers' consumption. It's much more difficult to, I think, put a quantifiable benefit on mitigating the retail risks, because they're not always as visible as kind of settlement inaccuracies. They're not always obvious to relate to a financial consequence, but one of the things we do need to do is try and find a way to bring those things together. So as we've set out in the forward work plan, we're absolutely keen to work with suppliers to identify where the costs to serve are arising from and where there are pain points in your service delivery that we could potentially do something about. So although we've identified risks to date and we're trying to monitor it, we're also trying to find out what it is that you're doing behind the scenes and potentially fixing without anybody else being aware of, that if we can actually trace back the root causes of those issues and put them right in the first place, it may be able to mitigate you having to do lots of exceptions processing, having your call centre staff having to make however many phone calls to put things right, etc. So I think it's absolutely right that we have to find a way to demonstrate that value to you as funding parties, as well as maintaining our focus on consumer outcomes. I think it's important that we recognise there's a dual requirement in this whole regime. So I'd hope that the second year will allow us to actually deliver some of those tangible and quantifiable outputs. I guess we've been focused very much on kind of the risks that might come from the new switching arrangements and the fact that we're not going to have as long to put things right. You know, certainly we always expected an uptick in erroneous transfers, for instance, because you won't have the amount of time to put in place those manual resolutions to prevent them going forward. But everything's changed in that sphere. You know, we're not expecting now large numbers of switching for the foreseeable future, but we will see lots of things going on around, you know, the management of debt and how you handle consumers, etc. So it may well be that our focus has to change away from, you know, the kind of things that we thought were going to be our priorities, you know, 18 months ago when we were focusing on this. But absolutely, yeah, we do need to demonstrate that there is a payoff from this regime being in place and from the costs of it.
Thank you. Okay, next question. Are you expecting entry to continue to be as busy given current economic conditions?
No, but a couple of things to say about that. I wouldn't have forecast many of the things that have happened in the past 2 years. So I do think we will have to obviously adapt as the market evolves. But like I do attribute the volumes of entry primarily to be a catch up. We should talk about, like, it's not consistent across the board. There have been far fewer people entering the market to be suppliers, for example, than we expected. Far more to be things like TPIs, metering providers. Realistically, whatever we would forecast now, the makeup will be slightly different in reality. However, I do expect a drop. The one thing that I would say is there are probably some trends that create spaces for innovation, and actually that is quite important. I do think there is a greater, a greater appetite out there for innovators to try and work out how to use industry data to deliver services often to parties in a more efficient way, or to change the way customers interact. I think some of the new technologies out there, or technologies like electric vehicles, will drive that level of innovation. So I think there probably is a trend of different types of organisations looking to enter the market. And actually, like, if you're a party, you know, us finding appropriate ways for them to enter is probably a way that supports you innovating and delivering for your customers as well.
Thanks, Anton. How are you going to be consistent in your approach to assurance given parties' performance? Sorry, against parties' performance.
Like, it's really important that we're consistent. It's really important, consistent, and we have been consistent in the past year. And I think the fact that we're using real evidence and real data as the jumping off point, and then overlaying with that the context of what's happening in the market and you know market conditions, allows us to be consistent. We've published a methodology that is applied equally whether you are, you know, a massive global business operating like a massive operation in this market, or a niche supplier who has a very niche business model that will never scale to 1 million connections or 1 million MPXNs. And similarly, we are consistent across the different types of organisation as well. They clearly have different obligations, but like the code is really clear, right? It says, you know, as a metering equipment manager, or as a supplier, as a domestic supplier, or you know, when doing this with a gas meter, these are your requirements. I think they are consistent for all. That's a really important principle of the code. It has to be a level playing field, doesn't it? And our role is being consistent and level-handed in that too.
Next question. If customers can have satisfaction that you give value for money in protecting their interests, how do customers know that you are doing this on their behalf?
That is a really interesting question that I hadn't thought of before coming to this webinar. I think you're right. I think we know that customer engagement in the market is low, and their understanding of the different elements of governance. I bet if I asked my friends who I tend to like about if they knew what the retail energy code was, I don't think they would be able to describe it. And I think that's probably true to a greater extent of a kind of a lower down element of the performance assurance thing. But I think you're right. There is a piece here. How do we make this visible? Perhaps we make our annual report available on a non-login part of the rec portal. Perhaps there's something more that we can do. I don't have the answer right now, but I think we should take that one away. It's a good question.
Thanks, Anton. And then finally, are you going to publish the targets and performance metrics for parties before the dashboards are released?
So I think that a really important part of that dashboard is understanding what that metric is and what it means. We will be talking you through that as in the run-up. In terms of targets, the target is complete compliance, right? These are regulatory obligations. So I think that's really important. There are different types of metrics we'll talk about, some that directly talk about your compliance and some that indicate performance risks and don't indicate anything else. They talk about maybe if someone has far more annulments or withdrawals than somebody else, that might be legitimate, but it also might indicate a problem. It's not a compliance thing. There is something perhaps that's being alluded to in this question, which is about the PAB and thresholds. So the PAB has set thresholds for us, not for parties, but for us, so that we focus in the key areas. the dashboards will include information on those thresholds, so you see it as we do, which I think is the question here. But it's really important. These are thresholds for our intervention. I think as an organisation, if you think you want to operate in this market, you should be complying with your regulatory obligations. I don't think we should see these as targets. I think that's quite an unhelpful way of thinking about it. But I said we will show you what we see, and one of the things we see is the threshold for our intervention.
Thanks, Anton. That was the last of the questions that we've received through Slido. Just a reminder, if anyone forgot, you can access Slido via the QR code that's on screen, or by typing the number on screen into your web browser at slido.com. I don't know if we want to give people a couple more minutes just to submit any final questions that they may have, or if you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share, Anton.
But thanks for the questions. It's a really important one. Thanks for your support over the year. We do want your input. That's really important.
Okay, it looks like we haven't had anything further come through, so perhaps if we move on, and then any questions that come in later, we can address it at a later stage, perhaps. So just a final thought from me. Thank you to everyone for participating in today's event. We would greatly appreciate any feedback that you may have, and we have set up a quick survey on Slido. Please feel free to submit any feedback through the question or the poll. And yeah, thanks again. Have a great afternoon.